Our reading this morning is from Rays of the One Light, weekly commentaries from the Bible and the Bhagavad Gita, written by Swami Kriyananda. What is it to fail spiritually? Truth is one and eternal. Realize oneness with it in your deathless self within. The following commentary is based on the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda. This first passage is from the Gospel of St. Matthew, chapter 25. Jesus tells the parable of the 10 virgins, 5 of them wise and 5 foolish. They await their bridegroom, the Christ consciousness. The wise virgins keep the oil in their lamps, symbolic of their devotion, lit through the night. The foolish virgins placed no oil in their lamps. These foolish ones are like the average devotee going through the motions of outer ritual by keeping no fire of love burning in the heart. When the bridegroom's coming is announced, the foolish virgins realize their mistake and hasten out to purchase oil. And during their absence, the Christ consciousness comes and embraces those who have been awaiting him with devotion. The foolish ones, by their lackluster devotion, are not accepted by him. Watch, therefore, Jesus told his listeners, for you know neither the day nor the hour wherein the Son of Man cometh. In Autobiography of a Yogi, Paramahansa Yogananda describes the foolish virgin, the consciousness he encountered in the Mahamandal hermitage that he stayed in as a young man in Benares. I was pleased, he wrote, that my new home possessed an attic where I managed to spend the dawn and morning hours. The ashram members, knowing little of my meditation practices, thought I should employ my whole time in organizational duties. They gave me praise for my afternoon work in their office. Don't try to catch God too soon. This ridicule accompanied one of my early departures toward the attic. Later during meditation, I felt lifted, as though bodily, to a sphere uncircumscribed. The Master cometh today. A divine womanly voice came from everywhere and nowhere. This supernal experience was pierced by a shout from a definite locale. A young priest named Habu was calling me from the downstairs kitchen. Mukunda, enough of meditation. You are needed for an errand. The Divine Mother's words are not spoken for the benefit of the priest, the foolish virgin, but for Mukunda, the wise virgin. For this was the day his Guru Sri Yukteswar came to him. Grieve not, friends, if you feel that you have been foolish. No error is forever. Some day, if you keep your lamp lit now, your opportunity will come. In the Bhagavad Gita, the 6th chapter, Krishna promises every devotee, Arjuna, none who works for self-redemption will ever meet an evil destiny. Spiritual failure, though a deep disappointment, is always temporary. Eternal hellfire is but a projection of vindictiveness in the human mind. And thus, through Holy Scripture, God has spoken to mankind. Om, Om. So one thing that's not mentioned in the reading is that Master, when he first came to this ashram, went directly to the Swami, the head of the organization there, and he said, what I'm wanting is inner communion. I'm wanting one-on-one communion with the divine. And there's a story about a man who was a rich man and a very worldly man. And he would go and visit a saint who lived rather remotely in the Himalayas. But he went to him, he had been a sinner, and he went to him not out of a deep desire of devotion, but it was more out of wanting to show others that he had repented and that he was religious now. And he felt that by going to this saint, they would get the idea that he was actually a good person and not someone, they wouldn't identify him with his previous sins. So one day he came with his wife and his 2 servants, and he said to the saint, we want you to teach us some spiritual teachings. And the saint looked at them and he said, that's fine, I can do that, and I will do that. He said, but first you must pass my test. And you, once you pass the test, then yes, I will go ahead and I'll teach you further. So they were walking along, and he said, all of a sudden the saint had the inspiration to go into a banana grove. And he picked 8 bananas off the trees, and he handed 2 to each one of the people that were there. 2 to the servants each, and 2 to the husband and wife. And he said, okay, this is what I want you to do. I want you by yourself to go out into the most remote place you can find, some place that's perhaps lonely and where a lot of people don't visit, or no one visits, actually. And I want you to eat these bananas, and I want you to eat them with no one watching you. And of course, the 2 servants and the husband stood up and said, that's no problem. Of course we can do that. We can find a spot easy where no one will see us. We'll pass this easy. And the wife very meekly stood up with all humility, and she said, if God ordains it, she said, I will pass the test and I will come back. He said, now you must come back before it gets dark. So the husband goes out, and he goes to a wealthy friend's house, and he tucks his bananas in his pocket, and he goes into their bathroom, and he walls himself off, and he eats the bananas in a big hurry, and he even eats the peels. And then he goes back to the saint with all of his pride and bravado, and he says, I passed, I did it. And the saint looked at him and he smiled and he said, it's interesting that you're back so early. And that was about all he said. So time went on, and the 2 servants had gone out into the jungle, deep into the jungle, and they each found a cave, and they ate the bananas within the caves, saying that no one, and assuming that no one saw them, and fully believing that. And so they went back to the saint, and they said, we've done what you've asked, we've gone, we've eaten, no one has seen us. And he said, are you sure no one has seen us? We're positive. We couldn't even see the bananas. That's how dark it was inside the caves. And he said, okay, all right, if you're sure no one has seen you. And they said, absolutely no one. Well, then much later the wife came back, and she was rather depressed and kind of tired, and she pulled out the bananas and she handed them to the saint, and she said, I'm sorry, I failed. I failed. And he said, what do you mean? She said, well, I thought, I would go to some room that was that no one had ever ventured into, and I thought I could go there, and then I thought I could go, into the deepest areas of the jungle where no man ever came, and then I thought I could go in deep into the forest, and then I even thought I could go deep into the recesses of my mind, and try to find some solace, some aloneness. And she said, but I went to this field where no one ever goes, and I saw this spiritual, this figure standing out there, and he looked at me and he nodded at me in the grass, in the tall grass. He just nodded to me. And then I moved on, and I went to a ravine, she said, or a mountain, and I saw the stones going up, and it was like the neck of the mountain, and it kind of moved. And she said, and I felt that something was watching me. And she said, and then I went to the caves. I went deep into the jungle. I went deep into these caves. And she said, and I felt something laughing at me. And it was like something I heard this voice say, you really think you can hide from this, in this eternal darkness? There's light. We are the light that comes in. And she said, and I tried really hard to ignore it. And then she said, all of a sudden the light appeared on the bananas. And I thought, no, I'm going to really ignore this. And I closed my eyes and I went deep within. And then all of a sudden my thoughts came up and they overwhelmed me, all my thoughts. And they were almost rebuking me. And they said, how do you think you can hide from what created us, which is the divine spirit, the heavenly Father, the eternal light? How do you think you can hide from this? So she said, I'm sorry. I came back and I failed. And he said, no. He said, you understood the test. He said, and the reason you understood it was because of your calmness and your humility. He said, you passed the test. And he turned to the other three and he said, this is your guru preceptor. He said, what she teaches, those lessons that she gives you from now on, this is what you must follow. And if I come, I will give you the exact same lessons. And so her devotion, her humility is what gave her the ability to see the divine presence and to understand and know that God was the doer. And so for all of us, devotion is extremely important when it comes to the spiritual path, and it must be given freely. It must be given freely and with deep sincerity, not like the rich man who, for show, basically was going to see the saint just for appearance's sake, but it's got to come from deep within. And our egos have got to understand truth and align to truth. We cannot get something just because we want it. It comes from a deep attunement, and that's God then propels forward. God then is the doer. God creates whatever it is or brings to us whatever it is that we're needing or that we're asking for. Master, the one thing with this reading which I'd like to emphasize is that Master, in the autobiography, if you go back and reread the story, he comes and he says, Swamiji, he's talking to the head Swami. He says, I don't understand what's required of me here. I'm seeking direct perception of God. Without him, I cannot be satisfied with affiliation or creed or performance of good works. So that was Master's deep, deep devotion, not only to his intent, but also to meditation. These people in this ashram did everything they could to deter him from meditating on a deep level. And he even said that it got to the point where they were so hurt by him that, and his aloofness toward them, because his dedication to meditation was so strong. But they were preoccupied with running the place, with including him in that respect, even so much so that this man comes at the end, after Master had this amazing meditation. He felt completely lifted up. He was praying deeply that he find his guru that day, or that he find his guru, and this call comes from downstairs. Mukunda, drop the meditation and come shopping with me. This is what you need to do right now. And Master said, I normally would have kind of been grumpy about it and would have said something, but he said, I wiped the tears from my eyes, because that's how deep his meditation had been. I wiped the tears from my eyes, and I obeyed, and I went down and went shopping. And what happened? He met his guru. And as in the reading, it says, God is not a tyrant. We all miss these opportunities time and time again, these deep spiritual opportunities. But they will come back. And as with Master, had he decided not to go with this man, he would have missed seeing that. He would have missed that opportunity to meet his guru. And so perhaps he would have met him the next day. Perhaps he would have met him 2 weeks down the road. Or perhaps he wouldn't have seen him for 20 years. or another few lifetimes. But God will come back around once we understand the lesson that we're supposed to learn. And one of them is, there's an affirmation with one of our yoga postures where you stand in Tadasana, which is basically you're just standing tall, relaxed. And the affirmation is, I stand ready to obey thy least command. Always tuned in, always listening to what God is trying to tell you. And I have a cousin who was in the Navy, and he was in the Gulf War. And my sister was in the Navy, and so was my mother. And his father was in the Navy. And he was out on a ship, and it was dark, completely dark. And he said, he wrote this letter to my sister. He said, I felt your mother and my father were with me when I was out there. And I think back on Master's story about his mother and how when she passed, Master heard Divine Mother say, it was me that was behind those two dark eyes, which I think with my cousin, that was Divine Mother. Behind both of them, his father and my mother, coming to console him in a form that was recognizable to him. And so for us, what we need to do is go within, discover the divine within, and then it will be revealed to us without, and we will truly understand that God is the doer behind everything, every aspect of creation. It's an ominous thought to think about that, to think about our planet right now. And every place on this planet, God is.
Good morning, friends. As I was thinking about this topic, we have a very complex and in many ways unhelpful relationship with failure in our culture. We glorify success, and at best we tend to shun failure, or maybe we look at it with disgust or fear or shame. And sometimes even with our own failures in our lives, we feel as if they're, unfortunately, we sometimes feel like they're a reflection of our self-worth. So it's not unreasonable, given our experiences with failure in our worldly lives, that we might wonder, well, what if I fail in my spiritual life? And what if I don't realize God in this lifetime? And I'll admit, I've had thoughts like this. But Yogananda wrote a lot about success and failure and gave us a lot of helpful attitudes or perspectives to have around this. Really telling us that Divine Mother expects that we're going to fail, that we're going to make mistakes, and that's okay. And that the season in which to move forward when we succeed, to successes when we fail. I'm going to read a couple of thoughts that he shared on this. If failures invade you repeatedly, don't get discouraged. They should act as stimulants to your material or spiritual growth. The period of failure is the best season for sowing the seeds of success. Weed out the causes of failure and launch with double vigor what you want to accomplish. So he's saying, don't get stuck in your failures, but use that as a prod to work, to put forth more energy and to do what you need to do to move forward. Here's one more. If you have an inferiority complex, remember that success, health, and wisdom are your rightful heritage. If you are firmly convinced you are a failure, change your mental attitude at once. Be unshakable in your conviction that you have all the potentiality of great success. At times, you may find it helpful to recall your mental reactions on occasions where you were unsuccessful in some undertaking. And so, in thinking about this topic today, I sort of reflected back on some of my earlier life experiences with failure and some of the lessons I learned from those. And I'd like to share some of those thoughts and experiences with you today. So the first story, and this is probably not my first experience with failure, but it's the one that stands out most prominently in my mind, was when I was a senior in high school. It was the spring of my senior year of high school. And I had one class that I was taking that was a sort of final requirement for graduation. It was a physical education class, PE, gym class. And there were a number of different modules or units in this class that we went through, different sports we had to try and engage in. And so about halfway through the semester, we got to fishing. And growing up in the Midwest as a vegetarian, I had never fished before, and I frankly didn't have a desire to fish. But nonetheless, I had to do this for the class. And so what we would do for 2 weeks, what we did was we went out to the tennis courts outside, and we would practice casting our lines into a hula hoop on the tennis court. I kid you not. And I've never considered myself very athletic, but if I apply myself, if I try hard at something, I can generally do fairly decently at it. So I got pretty decent at casting my line into the hula hoop. So at the end of 2 weeks came the test. And the day of the test, they inform us, oh, today for your test, you are going to cast your line into a hula hoop in the middle of the school's indoor swimming pool while you're standing from the edge. I went, oh, this is different. Totally different circumstances, and we didn't have any time to practice whatsoever. So we all line up to take our turns, and I was about halfway through the line, and a lot of people got it, a few people didn't. I go up. Okay, second time. Third time. I bombed the test. Now, the teacher had already told us that if we did not get it, that if there was any time at the end, he would let those of us who didn't get it to try once more each. So, not all hope was lost. So I hang back, and I get back at the end of the line, and there was some time at the end, so I go up for my last and final shot, and totally miss it. I felt terrible. And there at the tender age of 18, my entire life started to reel before me. I was an honor student, and I had just failed a test. And I thought I had recalled the teacher saying a few weeks before that if you didn't pass all of the exams for all of these different units that we were doing, that we would fail the class. And if I failed my PE class, I wouldn't graduate from high school. And what would happen to my college admissions? And what would my parents say? Now, I can laugh about this now. But those of you who've had teenagers, I was really distraught at the time. And I was so ashamed of my failure that I didn't talk to anyone. I didn't even tell my parents. And I had a really good relationship with my parents. I mean, they weren't like, oh, you better get good grades or else. I mean, they just expected that I would. I didn't talk to the teacher to clarify the passing policy for the course. I didn't want to draw attention to my failure. I felt so bad about it. Well, as you can imagine, I did pass my PE class. I did graduate from high school, and I did go to college, thank goodness. But, you know, in retrospect, all of that fear and shame that I had around this failure, just not only were they completely unnecessary, but they increased my suffering so much. And how often do we do this with ourselves? All right, so that's the first story. The second story, we're going to fast forward now a little over a decade, and I am a fourth-year medical student. And my boyfriend at the time, a good friend of his, was a rock climber. And his friend, we'll call his friend the rock climber Joe for purposes of the story. Joe invited all of us to go rock climbing with him. Now, I'd never been rock climbing before, but I liked hiking, I liked being in the outdoors. Joe was an expert, he was going to teach us. I figured, sure, let's go do it. So we head out one Saturday morning from Seattle up into the Cascades, and he picks sort of a beginner wall, maybe like 30 feet high and not too technically difficult, thankfully. And so the person, when you're rock climbing, the person who is holding the other end of the line, not the person who's climbing, but the person down below, is belaying the person who's going up. So Joe goes up to set some things for us to grab onto with my boyfriend at the time belaying him. And all goes well. He goes up, he comes down, no big deal. Joe then belays my boyfriend going up and coming down, and then me going up and coming down. It's all good. We take a break, we enjoy some lunch, and while we're eating lunch, Joe announces that he wants to go up one more time, and he can take his stuff down so he doesn't leave them up there. And why don't we give Michelle a chance to belay? Because I hadn't had a chance yet. And I didn't know any better, so I said, sure. So Joe teaches me what to do, how you're supposed to stand and sink your weight and hold on to the rope when you're on the ground. And he starts heading up the rock. Now, Joe was about twice my body weight. Joe gets up there, he gets his stuff, he starts coming down, and he has a freak slip. And so he starts to fall, and I start to go up into the air, actually about 3 feet up off the ground. That's not what's supposed to happen. But I had the rope in my hand, and his weight carried me up as he fell. So he gives me some instruction, and he gets himself stabilized, and I lower myself back down to the ground, and I'm trying to get myself situated, but before I'm completely anchored, Joe starts to move, and he has another freak slip. And I'm trying desperately to hold on to the rope that's in my hands. And he keeps falling, and pretty soon that rope is flying through the palms of my hands. And he basically free fell the last 8 to 10 feet down and landed on his back. So once he landed, I ran over, my boyfriend ran over to check on him. He was fortunately alive and conscious. And amazingly enough, there happened to be an anesthesiologist who was climbing a ways down from us, who ran over, which I was very grateful, because as a fourth-year medical student, I didn't know anything. And Joe could move his toes and his fingers, and we sort of were debating, what should we move him? Should we call for help? He was pretty uncomfortable lying on the ground, but the risk of moving somebody who has had a fall like that is if they have a spinal fracture and they start to move, they could cut their spinal cord and become paralyzed. So eventually Joe decides that he's going to take the risk and he's going to get up. And he did, and fortunately, he was sore, but all things considered, he was okay. And as you can imagine, I felt terrible about this. And so as my boyfriend is driving us home, I'm apologizing to Joe, and Joe tells me that, these 2 slips that he had, these freak slips, nothing like that had ever happened to him before. And, by the way, I had some safety gear that I didn't use that I should have. He had a locking belay device that, had we used it, that rope wouldn't have been flying through my hands. He wouldn't have fallen, and I wouldn't have ended up with second-degree rope burns on the palms of my hands. It took 3 weeks to heal after that. He didn't tie down the other end of the rope. So that night, I laid in bed thinking about the events of the day, and the thought, my gosh, I could have killed somebody today, ran through my head. And that thought was only followed by one more terrifying thought, which was, this is probably not the last time in my life I'm going to be lying awake at night having this thought. Because I knew in less than a year I was going to be a medical intern. And I knew that I was going to be asked to do a lot of things that maybe I didn't have the training to do, or I didn't quite know exactly what to do, and maybe didn't have supervision on hand at the time. It's a pretty terrifying thought. And realizing that, and what I've realized since is that, we're put in these situations all the time, not just in medicine, but in other areas of our lives. Maybe the consequences aren't quite so steep. But, even in medicine, there are times when we do everything right, and sometimes people die. And what I've learned is, it's not all about me or the physician who's in charge at the time, that in these life and death situations, it's God's grace, it's karma, it's whatever that's sort of playing out there. And there's a passage in the Tao Te Ching that I've been reminded of many times over the years. Do your work, then step back, the only path to serenity. Or as it talks about in the Gita, nishkam karma, action without desire for the fruits of action. Do our work and then not be attached to the outcome. Or as a friend said to me recently, do your best, God does the rest. And that's an important thing for us to realize and to remember. It's about, our part is showing up and being receptive, being in tune, and letting the divine flow through us, and to do whatever needs to be done. And yeah, we're going to make mistakes, things are going to happen, and God knows that, and that's okay. So I want to come back to our topic and our reading, and just emphasize what Devaki shared at the end of our topic, at the end of her talk. In this reading, Swami Kriyananda and Krishna in the Gita gives us this wonderful sense of hope and promise. We've all had moments of failure in our lives. We've all had lackluster devotion. That's why we're here. And that's okay. And God is going to keep giving us these opportunities. It's a couple of weeks ago when I gave service, and I shared a quote from a rabbi who remembered some of his past incarnations, and he says, I keep coming back until I perfect my ability to love. That's what it's all about. And this reading from the Gita, if you continue on, Krishna tells Arjuna that, the fallen yogi will go to some and at death goes to one of these higher realms, and then when he does come back to earth, is born into a good family and given the opportunities to continue along his spiritual path until he finally achieves that liberation. So remember that spiritual failure, worldly failure, even though disappointing, is temporary. And the end result is the same for each of us. We will all have that opportunity to merge and know and be one with that light within, that light that is our home and our source. We all will eventually return to. God bless you.